Thanks very much for joining us for episode 8 of InTek Freight and Logistics, the podcast. I'm Kevin Baxter, and I'm joined by my co-host for this edition, InTek CEO Rick Lagore. On this episode, we learn about sustainable freight practices via the EPA's SmartWay program. Then we'll follow it up with our MercuryGate Minute on some contract basics in the TMS. Let's get started. With plenty of heavy-duty vehicles needed to move freight each day, there's no denying the industry has an impact on the environment. But there are ways for everyone involved to mitigate that impact. Our guest for this episode is here to talk about one initiative that's hitting the 20-year mark, the Environmental Protection Agency's SmartWay program. We welcome EPA Region 5 Environmental Protection Specialist, Tony Maietta. Tony, thanks very much for joining us today.
Thank you for having me.
So first off, before we really get into the SmartWay side of it, tell us a little bit about what you do for the EPA and what Region 5 is.
Yeah, sure. So I have been with the Environmental Protection Agency since 2003, and I work in the Region 5 office in Chicago. EPA is divided into 10 regions nationally, and Region 5 covers the states of Minnesota, Wisconsin, Michigan, Illinois, Indiana, and Ohio. And so, it's pretty much the Great Lakes Midwest sort of area. And since 2003, I wear a lot of hats in Region 5. Primarily, my job deals with working on state clean air regulations. So the Clean Air Act says, your air has to be of a certain, cleanliness. And if you have pollution above that level, states have to come up with laws and ways to reduce that pollution. The way that the United States government works is that, if a state fails to take on those actions, the EPA can step in and do those actions for them, only if those state rules are on the federal books as well. And so I review state laws dealing with, clean air actions. We double check it against the Clean Air Act and make sure that there are, other sources to make sure that those rules will be effective and they meet all the criteria that they need to. And then in a way, we sort of put those on the federal books so that just in case a state does not, do the thing that they say they're going to do in that law or regulation, then EPA is able to kind of step in and do that. It's happened very, very infrequently since the Clean Air Act started, but it's just, sort of a backstop measure. But that way, we've seen, for example, like in Chicago where I live, the air is much cleaner than it was 30 years ago. You've seen drastic improvements in air quality across the nation. And then other programs that I work on are transportation conformity. And so that's where if you're going to use federal dollars to, say, put a new lane on a highway or build a brand new highway, you have to, kind of use air quality modeling to look at the traffic you think is going to be there and like what kind of impact that might have. And that makes sure that federally funded transportation projects and networks don't cause or contribute to air quality problems in metropolitan areas. I work on the Diesel Emission Reduction Act, the DERA program. And so there's this group called the Midwest Clean Diesel Initiative, run out of Region 5, and I'm the guy who kind of organizes that. We've been giving out grants under the DERA program since 2008 to turn over the heavy-duty diesel fleet in the United States ahead of schedule. And so it's basically retiring older vehicles earlier than you normally would, purchasing a brand new vehicle and destroying the old one. And now those grants have expanded with the bipartisan infrastructure law and the Inflation Reduction Act. There's $5 billion for electrified school buses and also, CNG and propane school buses. There's another $3 billion out there that you're going to see programs coming online in the next year or so for ports and vehicles and equipment that serve ports, like directly serve one or more ports for electrification projects there. And then another $1 billion to address in a way that we are still determining Class 6 and Class 7 medium and heavy duty vehicles. So there's a lot of money out there for grants, and I work on that. And then last but not least, I am the Region 5 SmartWay coordinator. And so, as we're going to see when we get more into this, I sort of do these sort of events. Like we're on a podcast right now talking about SmartWay and trying to get the word out about SmartWay and like telling folks why it's a good program, why they should join, the benefits of it, and, sort of cheerlead for that program and get the word out. So I wear a lot of hats, and that was a long explanation of them. But that's what I've been doing for the last 19 years.
A lot of overlapping hats in a way, right? Yeah.
Yes.
Good segue into the SmartWay program. So what would be like your general overview that you give of what the program is, how it came about, and why it's here?
Sure. So like I sort of indicated before with like the Clean Air Act regulations, there are federal regulations out there that are tailpipe standards, engine system certification standards. So it's the engine and all the different parts and what comes out of the tailpipe. You're not able to manufacture and sell a vehicle in the United States unless it meets EPA's certification standards. And that vehicle is certified for sale in the United States. And that's a federal rule. But like I had sort of indicated, there are voluntary actions that folks can take, such as like early retirement. Now, again, back in 2004, this, like you'd sort of indicated, we're rolling up on 20 years here on the SmartWay program. So the dynamics when this program started were a little bit different than they are today. Diesel vehicles were a lot, for lack of a better word, they were a lot nastier 20 years ago. There were fewer control devices that were on the engine and in that tailpipe system after the engine before the end of the tailpipe, like the diesel oxidation catalyst, particulate matter filters, selective catalytic reduction, all those things that are now sort of stock on a vehicle you buy in 2023. Those things did not exist, largely OEM back in 2004. And the other issue is, EPA does recognize very heavily that, diesel vehicles and equipment are sort of the backbone of our freight industry. And people need food, people need goods. We need these things to live and thrive and survive. And, diesel engines deliver those things. And so, EPA is not out there saying, hey, you have to get rid of that vehicle and do these very harsh things. This program came about because, there are actions that companies can take. Early on, it would be things like adding on those devices, or perhaps, when it was more new and novel, like the aerodynamics and, single wide tires, there's a whole lot of things that can increase the efficiency of the vehicle. And that could also, at the same time, reduce the emissions that come out of that vehicle too. So even if you don't touch the engine, but you put on like aerodynamic devices that, you're using less fuel to get the same distance. And there's two things there that are wins. So you're going to reduce pollution by doing that, but you're also going to save money by not using that extra bit of fuel. And so that's kind of really was originally the key driver, at least from my, outreach perspective. It's like, you can do these great things for the environment, but you're going to save money at the same time. And we started this off with truck carriers, and that's sort of been the backbone of this program. There has always been, like, for the truck carriers and other partners too, as we'll get into, like a benchmarking sort of component to that. So what SmartWay wants a company to do is to take stock of, look at your footprint, look at what the vehicles and equipment you have, and, look at the model years, look at how long they run. I mean, these are things that your fleet folks are going to hopefully know, how much fuel they use. These are all metrics. And then you can take that, here's where we stand right now. And you can look into the future and say, well, where do we want to be? Either with the number of vehicles, the type of vehicles, the kind of equipment, the, add-on things that may or may not be added on to those vehicles. So you take a number of different steps. And the SmartWay program promotes this. We have the tool when you apply that does this. And it started out as like an Excel sheet, actually. And now it's a web-based tool that's a lot more complicated. And, I apologize. It's been a while since I've actually been in the tool. And I remember it from its Excel sheet days. But, basically, quote unquote, page one of this thing is where you put in your company's information. And then you would put in the steps that you'd want to take. So say you have, 10 trucks and they're all from, let's just make up a year like 1995. And so you say, well, we got 10 of these trucks. And then the next couple of years, we're going to early retire like 3 of them and buy 3 new ones. Well, this application and this SmartWay tool utilizes our heavy duty emissions models. It doesn't crunch the numbers like the model does, but it gives you those coefficients, and it will say, you put in your vehicle information, you put in where you want to go, and the tool will tell you, like I said, both of the good things that'll happen. It'll tell you how much emissions you're going to reduce, which is something that you can know and feel good about. You can also communicate that to the public around where your company is, show that you're trying to be a good neighbor and a good steward and do the best that you can environmentally. But then the other thing is that it will also say, hey, here's how much fuel you saved as well. And you can put in the current price of diesel fuel and it'll give you a monetary number of that as well. So we're trying to find like the win-win scenarios for companies and for the environment, so they can take actions that, they can feel good about financially and environmentally. And that program has just grown. It's grown since then. And so now we have, several different categories. You're looking at like the shippers. So you have, warehouses that deal with all these truck carriers that come in. And so their metrics are a little different. It's, how many percentage of truck carriers coming in are your SmartWay partners? And I got to say, like early on, I was doing a lot of things like we're doing, like talking it out with folks. Once that the shipper category came online, they did a lot of the driving to get these truck carriers into the program because, they wanted to be able to say, hey, we're doing good things and get a higher SmartWay score and, be a good SmartWay partner. But they were driving a lot of these trucking companies to join as well. So this program has gotten pretty big. Now almost 20 years into it, we're almost at 4,000 companies and organizations that are partners in the SmartWay program. So it's really grown. Early on, I kind of called it like the Energy Star for trucks because, people remember turning on their computer monitors and seeing that Energy Star logo. We try to make it that, but for the shipping industry. So that's a little bit of a long-winded explanation, but the program, it started with the trucking companies and it's just grown since then.
Yeah, the way we got back into it, or I should say the way we got into it was back, I think around 2009, 2010. It was a shipper that said, I will only include carriers or logistics companies because logistics companies are also part of the SmartWay program as well. They went ahead and said, you can't participate in our RFP unless you are a certified SmartWay provider in some sort of fashion. So yeah, the shippers really helps drive that. And I just want to also just add on, the Excel spreadsheet was super difficult to work with. It may have been a little bit more simplistic, but I think almost every year I called you on something that I was struggling with as we were filling the information out. But I want to give a big hooray for the web version because that was a fantastic tool. It makes it super easy. I think we were able, based off of being able to do this every year, we know exactly what needs to be pulled. So now it's pretty much pull it down and upload it. And we pretty much have it done in about a half a day at this point. So
that's really good to hear. And the government in general, EPA tries to be faster than most, but we're slow to evolve. And so, but we always listen to feedback from our partners too. So that's very good to hear that webpage is much easier to use.
Much improved. And, a lot of people, when they think about programs that are put on by the government, they think, oh, this is going to be cumbersome. It's going to take a ton of time, a ton of resources. And are you really going to get the results out of it? And to be able to say, well, hey, we can do this in, 4 hours without taking too many resources out of the day makes it even easier and more of a reason to jump in and go do that. So anyway, just wanted to add that.
Oh, that's good to hear.
So you mentioned, trucking companies were kind of the starting point. We just mentioned shippers, logistics companies. So are those the different ways that you can become a SmartWay partner then?
Yes. Shippers, logistic companies, carriers, and there's a fourth category of affiliates. And so that's sort of like I am like the cheerleader for the program. These affiliates would be the same thing where they are organizations that will reach out to these three different categories to help folks join as a carrier, a shipper, or a logistics company.
So we've talked about this 20-year or so mark, and you talked about some of the changes that people made once they got into the program. So do you have any numbers on exactly, what the impact of SmartWay has been so far?
Yes. And okay, so there's always a little bit of a lag because, we'll get information and it takes a while to, quality assure it. So the numbers aren't up to 2023. But we are looking at the partnerships that we have. Almost 4,000 companies have helped reduce 152 million metric tons of carbon dioxide, 2.7 million short tons of oxides of nitrogen, and 112,000 short tons of particulate matter. And so those are large numbers. You see a gas coming out of the tailpipe of your vehicle, and you don't think that any of that stuff has any weight, but some of those particles do. And so when you were talking about tons of those particles, and especially particulate matter isn't any one specific material. It could be a heavy metal. It could be, a compound. It could be a toxin. It could be, any sort of element, but as long as it's of 2.5 microns in diameter or less. So it's very small particles that can get very deep into your lungs and can cross over into your bloodstream. And so that diesel engines, for better or for worse, do emit more particulate matter than passenger vehicles do because of the nature of the, diesel fuel is a heavier kind of fuel. And there's more in it. It's not as refined, which leads to its robustness in its use. And while I'm saying this, I also want to add, the newest vehicles that you could purchase today are cleaner than they've ever been. And they're drastically reduced in particulate matter from ones even just 20 years ago when this program started. Okay. So if you have a brand new vehicle, you can feel better about it than if you had one that's 20 years old or, older. But that's even more impressive because our partners are continuing on getting these reductions with vehicles and equipment that now emit less than they did before. So, there's a lot going on. Diesel vehicles and equipment do tend to run a lot longer than passenger cars. There are idle regulations, but it's a little bit of a holdover from when you had to run that diesel engine. Otherwise it would freeze up because the antifreeze is just kind of water, and so you'd pop the block if it froze. The old dynamics of running diesel engines aren't the same as they are today. But my whole point is that these vehicles, they do emit more than your passenger vehicles and smaller engines. They do run a lot, but despite that, there have been huge reductions from voluntary partners that have been doing these things. And that's another thing, is that these 152 million tons of CO2, 2.7 million tons of NOx on 112,000 tons of particulate matter, those were reduced like literally out of the goodness of these companies' hearts, kind of. They partnered up and did it. They didn't have to do it. And so this is an additional benefit to the air that we all breathe in the United States.
And so you mentioned some of the measures that people took early on when there were some very obvious changes to make to vehicles. So how has that evolved? What are people doing now? You mentioned that, most newer vehicles are better than even vehicles 5 years ago, 10 years ago, et cetera. So what are some of the measures that carriers in particular are taking to continue to reduce that environmental impact?
Yep. So there's the number of operational techniques that you can go after now too. And they've always been options as well. And it's all under the mantra of every little thing sort of adds up. So like I said, there's not, some states will have a statewide, or maybe in certain areas like Illinois has it in Chicago and St. Louis, like an idle ordinance, but if the company institutes one and says, hey, if you're going to be waiting to drop off the load or pick up a load, and you're just going to be sitting there for like 2 hours, idle it only for 10 minutes, an hour, or something like that. So you're shutting off that engine. You're not polluting, but you're not also spending money by literally just burning the fuel and just sitting there. There are actions that they can do to, you could put GPS units. And a lot of these things, again, are things that companies are just sort of doing, but it's just having them realize that, it's an efficiency improvement that does have some value. And here's how to quantify it, right? So it's, GPS tracking where those vehicles are going to make sure that they're taking the most efficient routes, not, spending a bunch of time like driving around the city looking for the places, going directly where they need to go. You can use those GPS units to also measure your driver's overall speed. And so a lot of companies might incentivize like limiting the speed, or suggesting you limit your speed to a certain, miles per hour, which would be the most efficient for your vehicles, your trucks to do going down the road. Those GPS units help ensure that you're getting the numbers you say you are. Different incentivizations, and I had also spoken about the aerodynamics that don't always come, OEM on those vehicles. So like trailer skirts, single wide tires and things like that, the fairings. There are still steps that can be taken outside of just outright buying a new vehicle. And there's one last option that is not for everybody, and it's generally much better for yard equipment and maybe forklifts and kind of things that might be at a warehouse. But certain non-road vehicles can get engine replacement. So you don't have to trash the whole piece of equipment. You could just take that older engine out and put a newer engine system in, which you're going to get the same work out of the same, frame, but with a cleaner engine on it too. So there's still a number of steps that folks can take. And, there's no magic bullet. Even if you do buy a new vehicle, you still have to put diesel fuel in it and, combust it to get it to go down the road. But when you add up all these little things, and especially if your company's doing, millions of miles, those do add up over time.
So we've been covering a lot about diesel engines. There's more and more conversation about electric vehicles hitting the roads, and talking it as whether it's going to be on the dray side first, is it going to be on the long haul side first? What are you seeing as you're talking with these fleets as to what they're doing? And is there any guidance that SmartWay can give these fleets on doing a transition to the electric vehicle if that's something that they want to do?
Certainly. If you go to the main SmartWay webpage, which is epa.gov/SmartWay, there's a little green box on the right side of the page. And the first bullet there is electrification resources for fleets. And so when I click on that, it's going to basically tell you the what, why, how kind of these electric vehicles. There is funding available for them. understand that they're not currently, electric isn't the answer for every sort of work type. You're not going to really totally see a long haul truck that's electric right now because, you kind of have to fill that truck with the batteries in order to get it to go that far down the road. It's physics, right? But we are seeing electrification in a growing number of, sort of work roles, definitely yard equipment, school buses. Like I said, there's the $5 billion out there for school buses, but the medium and heavy duty vehicles that there's $1 billion for that will be, outlaid in this year or the coming years. Like I think we're going to see some sort of program this year with the Inflation Reduction Act, medium and heavy duty vehicles program. And it could address like box trucks and delivery trucks, vehicles that have, a more localized range or maybe short haul drayage for sure. We've been seeing like electrification of cranes, marine vessels, locomotive engines, switchers. And like now we're hearing about, passenger locomotives. Like, for example, in Chicago, I think there's some rumblings that the Metra organization that the train I take to work, like they're going to electrify some of those. So it is a growing amount of options for electrification out there. There is a lot of funding for it from EPA and from other sources too. In SmartWay, it's an option. If you have the ability to, replace a diesel vehicle with an electric one, I mean, you're 100% reducing the emissions from that tailpipe. And yes, you can talk about where the grid comes from, but, that is something that can be addressed more at a single source or sources at the power plants versus, the hundreds of thousands to millions of vehicles that are out there on the road one by one. So, yes, there are options. There's a lot of educational materials and materials that'll point you towards resources if you're looking to electrify, some or all of your fleet or some or all of your equipment at your warehouse or whatever it might be, your yard.
Chicago lands in your district that you're responsible for. In terms of emissions, the LA Long Beach ports, there's a lot of discussion about what they want to do to reduce the emissions there. Have you seen that in Chicago at this point? Is there a lot of work there considering it's the largest inland port?
It is a focus area for us in EPA Region 5. I think it is an area of focus for the Illinois EPA, which, it's a state. We're not affiliated with them. We share the EPA name, but it's the state of Illinois government, the city of Chicago as well. So it's complex, I think is the right word for this, because, like I had indicated, there's a tailpipe standard and you can't sell or buy a vehicle or piece of equipment in the United States unless it's certified and meets that tailpipe standard. That includes locomotives. But the federal government can't tell you where you can drive that vehicle, what you can, it's yours and you own it. And so there are for locomotive engines and for category 3 marine engines. So it's 19 liters of displacement per cylinder or greater. I think it's either 17 or 19 liters. They're very large marine engines, basically. And so there is a regulation for those locomotives and marine engines that if they're from 1973 or newer and you rebuild that engine, you have to bring it up to, if it's available, like a tier, if it's a tier 0, there's a tier 0 plus standard if you rebuild that. But other than those large engines, there's nothing saying that once you buy it, it's yours, you run it. We're not in your business to tell you what you can and cannot do with it. But in California, they have state regulations and local regulations that the port or, the California Air Resources Board can dictate. These are the model years of vehicles and equipment that can come on this property. And you don't have that kind of, toothiness in the Midwest, really anywhere else than kind of California. States do have the option to adopt such rules that California puts out. So you can have more stringent rules than EPA, the federal regulations, but to this date, no other real states have done those things. So, we are constantly looking at, and the other end of this is the folks who live around these, the rail yards and the intermodal yards and all that stuff. They're concerned about what's going on in their backyards, right? And so we hear it from both ends. And, we try to do what we can to get the word out to these areas that, hey, there is funding. Hey, there are these voluntary programs like the SmartWay program where you can say, it's not going to be physically possible to uproot this rail yard and put it in the middle of nowhere. So it's going to be here, right? but these are the steps that our company is taking at this yard. And here's the reductions we're getting, and here's where we're going to go. So at least people around them understand that, they get it and they're trying to work on these things and do the best that they can to be a good neighbor. I don't know that totally addressed your question, but, there's not the toothiness to the regulations in Illinois that you see in California, basically. So there's only so much that can be done with the existing federal rules and the existing state and local rules in Illinois.
Well, it does feel, in talking about electric, for instance, for the long haul trucks, we also hear about hydrogen fuel cell, but it does feel like we're sort of at the beginning of a next phase here where that technology is starting to catch up, the infrastructure. There's a desire now more to build out the infrastructure that would, allow charging stations to be at the right intervals for longer hauls and things as well. So
yes,
in the next decade, it feels like things are going to be shifting a lot that direction.
I think so. There's a very large push. And, a lot of my time these days of all those programs that I talk about that I work on, it's the electrification programs, the school bus, the ports, the medium heavy duty vehicles that are in the spotlight right now. There are other resources out there like NEVI, the National Electric Vehicle Infrastructure Program. And I think that's the Department of Transportation. So that's, to put out a network of electric chargers and charging stations around the United States to make it viable for you to own an electric vehicle and go wherever you want and be able to charge it along the way so you don't run out, to make them more useful to people and to give them a wider, range for them to go. And yeah, there's going to be some hiccups, like the battery technology isn't the greatest yet. Like I own an electric bicycle, and when it's cold, it doesn't go anywhere near as far as when it's warm. And there's all the things you have to take into account, for the battery health and for the lifetime of the battery and the use you get out of it. But technology does always improve. And, we're at the beginning here. And so the push that we're seeing hopefully results in, I don't know that you're going to see electric vehicles and equipment, be the only fuel source for everybody. But I think you'll start to see them in wider applications, and they'll become more commonplace and less of a, novelty kind of thing as we go forward.
So it's fairly obvious if you have the heavy duty vehicles, you have trucks, whatnot, if you have these assets, how you're tracking your impact in SmartWay. So for the logistics providers, the shippers who may be farming this out, what are they tracking when they're SmartWay partners?
Yep. So like the shippers, and I hope I don't butcher this, but the shippers, it's the percentage of carriers that you're using that are SmartWay partners. And the logistics companies, it's basically maximizing the efficiency of the goods movement. So it's, the fewest links to get things there, making sure you're sending the most full truck full of goods, and not like a half full or quarter full vehicle and sending 2 or 3 of them instead, send one full one. It's the efficiency and the maximization. And again, it's like every little bit adds up. And so those are sort of the metrics for those companies, the operational efficiencies. And a lot of this, and I'm sort of like a broken record here, a lot of the stuff that folks are already doing. It's just kind of adding it up and quantifying it and measuring it, and it's not inventing new things. If you're a logistics company, you're brokering, movement and like where, who's going to take this where. I mean, it behooves you to do it in the fewest amount of moves too, and so it's just basically kind of almost like putting pen to paper for things that folks may already be doing. But there are tools too. So my understanding is that there's, the software that these companies use. There's a plugin that SmartWay makes that you can plug into it, that you just basically use your existing thing, your existing structure, and it just kind of feeds that information that needs to go, to SmartWay for your partnership. That will just automatically kind of be done for you. So it's like moving from the Excel file to the web page. Like we're trying to make it as transparent and easy for companies to be partners, to take these steps, to quantify things that they're probably already doing, and then to show them and to show everybody, here's the benefits to taking those steps.
Some of the additional adds on there I'll put in there is not only just the operations of moving from point A to point B most efficiently, but also picking the best
mode of transport. Yeah.
And picking the best mode to fit that transportation. So in our instance, our numbers are pretty good because a good piece of what we do is intermodal. So we help people convert from truckload to intermodal and improve on the SmartWay numbers for them.
Yep. And it does make a difference. And, we've always talked to our federal partners over at the U.S. Maritime Administration. They've got those marine highways it may take a little longer, but there's, for how much fuel you're using per ton of goods moved, you're getting a lot of bang for your buck, moving things in different modes. And yeah, I mean, like that, we in the Midwest are blessed with the third largest intermodal hub in the world, in Chicago. So like I think that we have got a lot of companies that are able to take advantage of a lot of different options in our region.
Agreed.
So after hearing all this, if somebody is out there thinking, well, I'm not a SmartWay partner right now, but I'd like to learn more, get into this, what do they have to do?
Yep. I would say go to epa.gov/SmartWay. And on that page, it will basically, it's got like you can learn about the company. There's the Participate in SmartWay block. And just pick if you're a shipper, logistics company, carrier, or if you want to be an affiliate, just click on that. There are going to be, a short list of not sort of like instructions, like an outline of what your partnership would entail. And then at the very bottom will be a form to either fill out or like a link to click to get to a web form, or just like a, hey, I'm interested form that you could submit to EPA. And like I said, I'm a regional guy working for 6 different states trying to get the word out about SmartWay. But if you apply for the program, we've got a bunch of staffers and contractors in our Ann Arbor office and in other locations. You're going to be assigned a single person who will always be your contact until, either you or they retire. But you'll always be dealing with the same partner account manager. And that person will be, they're super knowledgeable, much more than I am, of the inner workings of the program. They will be able to answer any of your questions and get you across that application finish line. And then anytime throughout your partnership, they'll let you know, like, hey, it's time to update, fill out this form again, or is this still correct from last year, to keep you up to date as a partner in the program. And then any questions, comments, or issues you might have can be dealt with through that person as well. So it is hopefully as automated, but also personal as possible to join the program. But yeah, epa.gov/SmartWay is the best place to start.
Great, Tony. Thank you very much for taking the time today.
Yeah, anytime. Thank you for having me.
Really appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you much.
On our MercuryGate Minute, one of our experts on MercuryGate Transportation Management System software, TMS for short, answers a question, outlines a feature, or offers up a quick tip on using the platform. Here's Tracy on the basics of contracts.
A contract in MercuryGate is a record of the terms of an agreement between a MercuryGate client and a carrier, or between a MercuryGate client and its own customers. Each contract must be a type, and there are 5 types of contracts in the TMS. A carrier contract, which is between the TMS enterprise and its carriers. A customer contract, which is between the TMS enterprise and its customers. A carrier bid contract, which is used in private bid boards. A no-line haul contract, which is related to fixed schedules such as rail, ocean, and air. And a gain share benchmark contract, which is related to share savings. Access to contracts is granted via a role permission. In the role, from the Rate Management tab, you must assign read or write access to contracts. Each contract must be granted to an enterprise level within the hierarchy to be used at that enterprise. To return rates, a contract must declare one or more negotiated lanes that the contract covers. Each contract will use either a MercuryGate rate table, a web service, or an alt rating file.
For more information on InTek's MercuryGate partnership, visit www.intekfreight-logistics.com/TMS. Thanks for joining us for InTek Freight and Logistics, the podcast, and thanks very much to Tony Maietta for taking the time to speak with us. Check out the links in the description to learn more about everything we discussed. Subscribe or follow now to ensure you get our latest episodes as soon as they're available. And you can help us out by rating and reviewing us wherever you listen. If you have questions, email us at podcast@inteklogistics.com and visit intekfreight-logistics.com for more about what we do. For Rick Lagore, I'm Kevin Baxter. We'll talk to you next time.